The Awakening, from the Fempiror Chronicles, by George Willson. Chapter 19. Rash Actions. It had been 2 days since David's funeral, and the town had been very solemn and quiet. Few people had gone out, and Abraham's father had allowed him time from his apprenticeship to mourn for his friend. He had remained home the majority of yesterday and today, but he had decided to see his father this afternoon back at the shop. While his father was showing him something new, he had noticed Beth pacing the square, spinning yarn on a drop spindle, appearing distracted and blank. His desire for her had drawn him to see her, but as he moved outside, she wandered into her family's store. He stood on the porch of his father's shop, which sat on the north side of the town square, 2 stores to the west of the Carpenter family store, which primarily made furniture, but they could fashion most anything someone requested. Sunset was coming on, and Abraham hoped to catch her as she made her way home. She walked out of the store carrying her drop spindle in one hand, and a pair of large wooden knitting needles in the other. She didn't look that much different from the girl who had caught up to David and him, eliciting huffs and tisks from the women of the town, only 4 days earlier while carrying the full ball of yarn she'd spent a couple of weeks making herself. Her days had become clear to him at that point. To require more yarn so soon meant she had holed up in her room and spent her days knitting an item she had dreamed that she and David would share together when finished, the blanket for 2. The one thought that had given him any measure of comfort through this loss was that she would need someone to be with her now that David was gone. Their threesome had been reduced to 2 in a way that neither of them anticipated, but he loved Beth as much as David did, though she had never shown it to him beyond the friendship they shared. Could she find comfort in his presence? Could the idea that this tragedy had not completely dashed her hope for a family comfort her through her sadness? Could he be the rock she could cling to until her grief subsides? There was only one way to find out. He stepped off the porch of the store and walked toward her. She glanced up and smiled briefly at seeing him, but continued her slow walk across the square. "What are you doing?" he asked. Beth shrugged. He kept pace easily with her slow stride. She looked at her wooden needles. "I broke one of my needles," she said with a sniffle. She laughed quietly to herself. "I asked Dad for another one, and he made me 2. She gathered her spindle and needles and held them close to her. He nodded uncomfortably. He wanted to keep her talking and was unsure of what else to ask. "How are you holding up?" he asked, hoping this would not elicit too much of a cry. She shrugged again. "Good, I suppose," she said. "I don't know what I'm going to do." This made his heart race a little. It meant she was actually considering her future without David. "Well, you still plan on getting married and having a family, right?" he asked hopefully. She sighed. "I planned on doing all that with David. But what are you going to do now?" "Abraham, I don't think—" "Beth," Abraham said, interrupting her, "I've tagged along behind you 2 my entire life, but inside, I've always wanted to be with you." She stopped. He halted next to her, looking into her face. She did not look at him but stared at the ground for a long moment. She closed her eyes. "Abraham," she began, but he interrupted her again. He could not allow her to talk herself out of the idea before he had his say in it. "I don't mind saying it," Abraham said. "I will miss David. He was my best friend, but maybe we were meant to be together instead." He placed his hand on her shoulder, but she shook him off violently and took a few steps away from him. She opened her eyes and glared at him. "He was your friend," she said incredulously. "He's gone, though," Abraham said. He was feeling desperate already. "He's never coming back. I don't want to minimize your grief, but you have to move on." "Abraham, it's not that easy." "Why not? What did he have that I don't?" "He would never talk to me like this so soon after losing a loved one." Beth turned to walk away from him, but Abraham was not going to let her go like this. He walked quickly in front of her to block her path. "Come on, Beth," he said. "What are you waiting for? But the words never came out. Beth screamed, "Get away from me!" And with unexpected strength, she pushed him to one side, dropping her spindle and needles. He crashed against Hagen's statue, knocking the wind out of him. He coughed a few times, but Beth did not wait to see if he was all right. She angrily gathered her things and turned away from him. He watched her walk the rest of the way across the square to her house on the south end of town. He could see she was not ready yet, but at some point she would be. He would bide his time and try again later. After all, they were going to be spending their lives together in this little town, so there was no rush in their trying to end up together. At some point she would understand that David was gone, and that his memory could not keep her forever. Abraham would not compete with his dead friend over the love of Beth. He did not know how long it would take her to come past her grief, but it would happen, and when it did, he would be there. Abraham sat up and pulled his knees to his chest. The sun was going down beyond the horizon, and there was still a curfew, but at this point he did not care. He just wanted to watch the sun go down and be alone with the night and his thoughts, and since the stricter ban allowed no one outside, alone he would be. Not even the Wits' End Tavern was allowed open after dark during these times, so there would be no one to stop him. His parents would wonder where he was, but he would not be out that late. David leaned against the wall of the main cave where hundreds of Alewo had gathered throughout the day. The crystalline structures on the ceiling reflected considerably less light than they had done when they arrived, meaning that night was approaching. The primary source of light was turning to the lighting system that Zechariah had introduced him to a few days ago. Some of the Alewo were resting on more cots spread throughout the large chamber, and in other small caves off the chamber such as the one he and his companions had been in, while others were simply talking amongst themselves. The Rostim he had come with had long since disappeared in the tumult of the Alewo after they had made their plans, and Zechariah instructed him to remain near their sleeping area. No one took notice of him, the only one not dressed in the dark colors of either Rostim or Alewo, as he stared at the warriors preparing for battle. Gone was the modern dress of Aram that he was used to. All these Fempiror were wearing black, their dark ancestral color of war to blend them into the darkness. Bored, he decided to walk along the wall to the right of the cave they slept in. After a short distance he found a considerably larger cave that contained the levicarts he and the others had left in the cave outside. Recalling what Ulrich had said about the interconnectivity of the caves inside and outside, he guessed that this was actually the inside of the cave they'd originally stopped in, and opened to allow the carts or anyone else to leave from this point, instead of finding their way out through the Eruftium labyrinth. He entered the chamber and recognized the carts of Vladimir and Tiberius, and finally ran across Zechariah's, that still had the chaser lashed to the rear of it. He touched the small, thin variation of the larger carts, and remembered how quickly it had caught up to Zechariah outside of Aram. He glanced up at the wall, and saw a small handle to one side, and a hinge assembly on the other, and he grasped quickly how it operated. It was nothing more than a big door. They were not too far from Hoggenstown, and he remembered roughly the way to get back there. He wondered how far he would get on this chaser before they discovered he was gone and tried to come after him. The chaser was faster than Zechariah's levicart, but he did not know how fast the others were. They might be faster than Zechariah's, meaning they would catch him quickly. If they chased him immediately, they would be on him once he got to his destination without his being able to do anything. He looked at the chaser closely. The chaser was set up so that a Fempiror would straddle its body and keep himself up by holding a pair of handles that rested horizontally at about chest level. The controls were laid out very similarly to Zechariah's cart, and David was able to find the switch to start the levitating. It appeared that the forward handles were the control levers, one on each handle, allowing the driver to twist the entire handle forward to gain speed, and adjust them forward or backward to turn or slow down. He reached out and twisted one of the handles to confirm his idea. "David?" a voice sounded from behind him. David jumped back away from the chaser and twisted around to face Zechariah, whose voice he recognized when his senses came to him. Zechariah crossed the cave to stand near David. He looked at the chaser briefly, and then back to David. "What are you doing in here?" Zechariah asked. David shrugged. He certainly could not tell Zechariah his thoughts, or Zechariah would only lose his temper. again. David began before thinking it through, and then came to his excuse. Walking around. I won't have much to do for a while. Zechariah nodded. This is true, he agreed. David looked at the Levicart, formulating his thoughts. A lot has changed since I first saw this machine, he said, now touching the back of the Levicart. Since I first saw you. Please forgive me. It's hard. I guess you know that. Zechariah smiled warmly, making David almost regret his idea of leaving. You may be assured that anything you have said, I understand, Zechariah said. Your goal will be to assimilate yourself to your new life, and to make the most of these circumstances. David nodded. Thank you, he said. Zechariah placed his hand on David's shoulder and smiled. Take care of yourself, David said, truly meaning it. Don't get into too much trouble, Zechariah replied. I won't, David lied, formulating the final details of his plan as they turned and walked back to the main chamber. Once back in the chamber, he found that in the short time he had been in the chamber with the Levicarts, the Alewo had assembled into a rough formation fitting to the contours of the crystal cave, all dressed in dark clothing with hoods attached, but hanging down on their backs. Yori and Kaltesh stood at the head of the formation facing Ulrich and Tiberius, who stood side by side facing the assembly. Zechariah pointed to the wall next to the cave they had exited, telling David to stay near where they had entered as he walked to the assembly and stood next to Kaltesh, facing the leaders. The group was already quiet, and waited for Ulrich to speak. Fempiror of the Alewo Order, Ulrich said loud and clear, his low voice reaching to the very ends of the cavern. Today, the Tepish Order has broken their promise to us. They have raided our home and done wrong to our guests. After centuries of living in silence, the time has come again to show that we are not as docile or sedentary as they believe, to show the true strength of the Alewo. Our Rostem brothers and sister stand with us and bring their own experience to help us. In exchange for their goodwill, we will help them in their battle to prevent the Tepish from practicing their slow genocide on the human populace of our world. We will no longer hide. We will no longer be a mystery to outsiders. We will adopt the code the Rostem have held for centuries. We vow not to allow the Tepish to enact their revenge. With great solemnity, we vow to be the last Fempiror. There need be no more. At this declaration, the Alewo beat their chests in unison twice in rapid succession. Ulrich continued, You have your assignments. Gus klugdin Jehovah batosufumor. As one, the Alewo lifted their hoods from their resting places on their backs and covered their faces. Like a few hundred shadows, they all disappeared out the various exits afforded by the passage-riddled caverns. Ulrich led a dozen Alewo, along with Tiberius, Zechariah, Kaltesh, and Yori, through another tunnel. David guessed it only took perhaps 30 seconds from the end of Ulrich's speech for the cavern to completely clear. He had never seen the small population of Hoggenstown move in such unity, and the cave held many more, so he was very impressed with the Alewo level of discipline. He waited a few minutes for the extra Alewo whose job it was to keep this cavern safe and ready for the warriors to return, to disperse to their various duties before he moved as well. He turned back to the cave holding the Levicarts, knowing that this would be his only chance. If he were lucky, he might even be able to return before they noticed he was gone. He walked quickly to Zechariah's Levicart and switched on the chaser. He heard it hum to life and saw it tug on the rear of the Levicart as it struggled to hold itself up against the bonds of the cart resting on the ground. He untied the ropes, and the chaser rested freely about a foot off the ground between the rear of Zechariah's cart and the outer wall. The light coming in through the crystal cave showed that there was still some sun out, so David opened the hold of Zechariah's cart and retrieved a day travel cloak. He did not know how much sun remained, but since it was summer, it could still be light for some time, and he could not look at the sun to gauge the time. He walked to the handle on the outside wall that he had found earlier, and pulled it. Despite the mountain rock construction of the door, it moved very easily on the hinges. He would not have the time to close it behind him, but the light that was coming in was indirect, and they would see it from the other chamber, so someone would close the door behind him soon. He ran to the chaser and sat on the seat behind the levers. He checked his cloak quickly to ensure that he had securely attached it. Suddenly he heard footfalls behind him. "Hey, what are you doing?" a voice called out. David turned to see one of the Alewo medics standing at the entrance. He looked back to the open exit and twisted the handles forward. The chaser blasted out of the cave, faster than David had anticipated. He was grateful for the coverage provided by the cloak, or the wind would have whipped it right off his back. Even the hood stayed in place. He steered the chaser to the east, to where he remembered seeing Hoggenstown on the way to Erufdium. The grass fields flew by underneath the chaser at speeds David never dreamed he would reach in his life. As the initial thrill wore off, David looked forward and could just make out the speck of a little town many miles off, resting in the setting sun. Ulrich led the small quartet of Rostim ahead of his own Alewo through the halls he had helped to carve over the past 400 years. The idea of a coup against the Tepish had never occurred to him, since such impulse was against his nature. However, as the Tepish had openly violated their friendship and suddenly decided to take over, they left him with little choice. It was this or leave. He had sent his Alewo to every corner of the plateau in the hope that his people would serve to divide the Tepish forces enough that they had a chance. The goal of his own group was Nikolai and the throne room. Nikolai made him a promise 25 years ago that the Tepish would keep to themselves and not interfere with the Dark West way of life. But slowly, Nikolai had moved into Ulrich's own hall and set himself up as some kind of personal advisor, a position that Ulrich had neither offered nor approved. As Nikolai seemed to be positioning himself to take Ulrich's position, Ulrich believed he would set himself up in the Hall of the Deldral as the leader of the Dark West, while attempting to remove all the remaining Alewo from their home. It did not take long for them to work their way through the passages to the Deldral Hall, as they encountered minimal resistance. In fact, Zechariah's comment as they reached the door echoed his own thoughts. "That was too easy," Zechariah said worriedly. "It is possible we took them by surprise," Ulrich replied. "The Alewo are not known for their rash actions. That's more of a Rostim trait." Zechariah smiled at the light jab at his sensibilities, though it was true that Alewo kept a cooler head than the sword-wielding Rostim. They tried the door, but it was locked. Ulrich took a step back and closed his eyes. He visualized the door in pieces and passing into the room behind it. He gathered his strength. Though the door was solidly made, the locks would not stand to his might. He reeled back his arms and shot his fists forward, smashing the locks and flinging the doors wide open. But the room was empty. Everything from the tapestries to the rock throne that had rested in this room for hundreds of years was just where it had been. He studied the various ways out of the room if Nikolai had indeed been here to begin with. "Thoughts, Ulrich?" Tiberius asked. "There are many passages from this room," Ulrich said, "but I would take this one." He walked to the rear of the room, where the builders had hidden a passage behind the tapestry that hung behind the throne. The door rested between some wooden posts that the tapestry hung on. Between the posts and the door there was a great deal of space, almost like a small hall. The door behind the tapestry, however, was another hallway to nowhere. The actual escape from the Hall of the Deldral was to the right, where there was a door hidden in the molding that led into a passage into the inner workings of the cave network. Ulrich opened the door to the surprise of his Rostim companions. "This also used to lead to the crystal caves," Ulrich explained, "but we blocked that passage as soon as Nikolai discovered this escape on his own. It does lead to our power center, however, and provides a good place to either make your escape or, as likely as not in this situation, to ambush someone." They passed through the door, and the trailing Alewo closed the door behind them. They walked a short distance down this bare hall, but Ulrich sensed something was wrong. This hall had never been long before. Tiberius opened his mouth to say something, but Ulrich held up his hand to stop him. He looked around cautiously and could hear footfalls very near. It sounded like they were behind the walls. "They're here," Ulrich said. As if on cue, paper-thin walls collapsed to reveal the large room that Ulrich had expected to see filled with young Tepish warriors, swords out and ready. Nikolai stood among them watching his prey. The Rostem drew their swords, and the Alewo assumed a ready position, waiting for the strike. "So predictable, Ulrich," Nikolai said, stepping out of the throng of Tepish. "I knew you would look here." "We have nothing to say, Nikolai," Ulrich said. Never before had he longed to take someone's throat so completely. "Then I bid you farewell," Nikolai said with more than a hint of superciliousness. Nikolai walked away from them, and the warriors swarmed. Despite the overwhelming numbers and their obvious training, Ulrich was able to defend himself easily against their blows. Knowing how brainwashed they had been by the Tepish, he had no desire to kill them, but he had to incapacitate them, so they would not hurt any of his people. With blinding speed that not even his victims saw, Ulrich moved around them, throwing punches hard enough to break bones, but not kill them. The recipients of his blows ended up on the floor, writhing in pain, but alive. He glanced at the others and found that the Rostem and his other Alewo were easily holding their own against the apparent onslaught. Nikolai was a fool to set such a rebellion against them with such a young force, and he felt the fool for allowing it. Ulrich broke the line easily, and followed Nikolai through a door at the far end of the large room. The door led to the Eruftium Plateau's enormous water-power chamber. A thick stone walkway without curb or rail spanned the 100-foot diameter of the cylindrical chamber over an underground lake dozens of feet below. Churning pools had always been the hallmark of the Fempiror power supply, powering everything from their lights to their levicarts, and the sparks that flowed under the water in this chamber lent an eerie glow to the dim lighting in the room. Power lines ran up from the bottom of the lake against the walls and out various holes, feeding the power to the lights throughout the caves of the plateau. Ulrich walked slowly into the chamber, wondering where in this featureless room that Nikolai could have disappeared. He walked towards the door at the far end of the room, but a sound behind him drew his attention. He turned to find Nikolai leaping down from above the entry door, where he had perched himself on the wall, using a line exit hole as a handhold. Without time to react, Nikolai kicked the old Alewo back, causing him to slip off the edge of the walkway. Ulrich recovered quickly, though, and while Nikolai was drawing his sword, Ulrich grabbed the edge of the walkway, kicked off its rocky side, and flipped back to the top of the walkway in enough time to block Nikolai's first sword blow. Ulrich had often been curious as to Nikolai's skill as a swordsman, since he had only ever seen him face off with new recruits in the large gathering chamber. Now forced to defend himself against Nikolai's onslaught of blows, Ulrich found him to be as simple as his own crew. Nikolai seemed to be working desperately to get through Ulrich's defenses, yet Ulrich had done little more than block him without attempting a hit of any kind. Clinks of the sword fainting off of Ulrich's gauntlets rang through the large chamber, echoing off the walls and ceiling, but still Nikolai's blade could not find its mark. His desperation was clearly mounting as his blows were losing their focus. He brought down his final blow to Ulrich's gauntlet again, but this time Ulrich swept Nikolai's sword to one side, surprising him. Ulrich reeled back in an instant and hit Nikolai square in the face. A sickening crack sounded through the emptiness of the room as Nikolai's head swung straight back, breaking his neck as well. His body went limp and fell straight back, thudding on the stone walkway. Ulrich stood beside the corpse and looked at it sadly. The door opened, and the Rostem and Alewo he had left in the other room stormed in. Tiberius left the company at the entryway and walked to Ulrich. He looked at Nikolai's body and back to Ulrich. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "It is such a waste to spend one's life in the hatred of others," Ulrich said. He looked at Tiberius. "Tell me, Tiberius, do you fight because you love man, or hate the Tepish?" Tiberius looked at him for a moment silently. He glanced back to Nikolai, considering the answer carefully, and then looked back at Ulrich. "It is for the love of mankind that we have always fought, but to love man is to hate the Tepish." Ulrich nodded solemnly. "Well said," Ulrich said. "Then we have much to finish. He looked at Tiberius, who appeared ready to head back to the battle. "Shall we go?" Tiberius asked. Ulrich nodded, and they ran out of the chamber to face the rest of the Tepish forces.